Good morning. Welcome to Trefethen Family Vineyards for the Napa Valley Grapegrowers 2013 Harvest Press Conference. Harvest has begun in the Napa Valley. Everyone's very excited, and today we have three experts to talk to you about what the growing season has looked like to date and where we see it going forward through this wonderful harvest season. Remi Cohen is the Director of Winemaking and Viticulture at Lede Vineyards. John Ruel is President of the Napa Valley Grapegrowers and COO of Trefethen. Allison Cellini is the Viticulturist at Renteria Vineyard Management, and the three of them are ready for your questions. Use hashtag NVGHarvest and on Twitter or at NVGrapegrowers, and we'll let the conversation begin. Good morning.
Good morning. My name's Remi Cohen. I'm the Director of Winemaking and Vineyards at Lede Vineyards in Stags Leap District. I'm also on the Board of Directors of the Napa Valley Grapegrowers Organization. At Lede, we farm 60 acres in Stags Leap. We have both hillside vineyards and valley floor vineyards surrounding our winery, and they're planted to all 5 major Bordeaux varietals, mostly Cabernet Sauvignon, and we produce Bordeaux blends and Sauvignon Blanc. And all of us here are really blessed to be grape growers in the Napa Valley, not only because of the fortunate geography, the great diversity of soils, and our wonderful climate here, but also because of the efforts of the Napa Valley grape growing community and our farm workers. In fact, we understand that the value of Napa's grapes are so important. In fact, to our community, Napa Valley's grapes in 2012 were worth over $650 million. One single average ton of Napa Valley grapes is worth over $3,500, and Cabernet averages over $5,000 per ton. And at all extraordinary sites in Napa Valley, it can be much, much higher than that. So in Napa, we are at the cutting edge of technology, and we have a long-standing tradition for farming. And one of the things that we value here is our farm workers. And the Napa Valley Grapegrowers Association has a Farmworker Foundation that has been created to support and enrich the lives of our farm workers through educational services, training programs, and community resources, including scholarship programs. Due to the education of our farm workers and all of the efforts on behalf of Napa Valley grape growers, we have the ability to respond to the nuances and challenges of a grape growing season. And like any season, 2013 has its own nuances and challenges. The year has been trending warm, it's been trending dry, and so far it's been trending early. In a dry year like this year, what we do in the vineyards has a bigger impact, and we can make a bigger footprint than in a wet year. So, for example, irrigation early was critical to getting vines established and uniformity, health and uniformity in vine establishment early on. After that, we could withhold irrigation. One of the main characteristics of the 2013 vintage was a major heat wave that we had at the end of July that lasted into right around the 4th of end of June that lasted right around to the 4th of July weekend. And it was quite hot, and there's many ways that we can deal with issues like that. So the most important is when you're laying out your vineyard. And if you have the proper row orientation, the proper trellising, that's going to be the main way that you can mitigate the damage of a hot afternoon. However, not all vineyards are laid out the way there's other overriding factors that may impact how you orient your rows and such. So there's many other factors and practices that we can use. For example, it's been trending recently to do less canopy management in terms of opening leaf removal in the canopy area. It's understood that dappled sunlight in the fruit zone helps mature a nice uniform crop. So this year we chose to do less lateral removal and leaf removal in the fruit zone to allow the natural shade of leaves to protect the fruit. In some instances, for example, at our hillside vineyard at Lede, we applied shade cloth on the western side of the fruit zone. This is an expensive and time-consuming practices, but many growers are choosing to do this now to protect our crop. In some vineyards where we have adequate water supply, people use micro sprinklers or sprinklers to cool the vineyard in the afternoon heat. And we've recently learned to save water either by using micro sprinklers or pulsing the systems on and off. So all things are being considered here, not only protecting our crop, but also protecting our natural resources. It was amazing how well the vines survived this heat wave. There's been maybe some little bits of damage that we're going to talk about a little bit in more detail later, that we're thinning right now, doing a green drop in our fruit of anything that hasn't fully colored. At Cliff Lede, we anticipate harvesting Sauvignon Blanc later this month, which is about 10 days to 2 weeks earlier than normal for us. And we'll be harvesting our early Bordeaux varieties in early September, and we anticipate harvesting most of our Bordeaux reds in September and the first 2 weeks of October, which for us is about 10 weeks to 14 days early. And all of this is weather pending, so we'll see how it goes.
Thanks, Remi. I think before we move on, I want to make a comment on the format of today's conference, which is I really encourage you, our viewers, to send in your questions via Twitter. We each have a few things to say, but we really look forward to some interaction, both among us on the panel, but also you out there in the viewing audience. As Jen indicated, we are here at Trefethen Family Vineyards in the Oak Knoll district of the Napa Valley. The Trefethen family has been farming this property since 1968, and since that time we've produced our own estate-grown wines. We also sell about a third of our grapes to other wineries here in the Napa Valley. Going further back, there have been grapes planted on this property since as early as 1886, which is actually when our historic winery building was constructed. Here in the Oak Knoll district, we're in a very interesting spot in the Napa Valley. We are up valley from Carneros and slightly warmer than traditional Chardonnay and Pinot growing area. We are closer to Carneros though than areas up valley and therefore cooler. So we're somewhere in between, and we're able to grow 9 different varieties of grapes. We're growing world-class Cabernet right next to world-class Chardonnay. But we do it in different soils, and we take very different approaches to farming. As far as this season goes to date, we're really excited. It's been, I think as Remi said, it's been a warm year. We're definitely trending about 2 weeks early. As far as the size of the crop goes, it's a little early to say, but I'd say it looks like we will hit our targets and maybe a little bit more. I think last year, part of the big crop that we all enjoyed was because we had big clusters. If I were to describe the crop this year, I'd say we have a large number of clusters, but the clusters themselves are not going to weigh as much as they did last year. Often when we have a drier spring, we can expect smaller berries, and in a grape like Cabernet, that can be fantastic for quality. Although it's been a great vintage and we're very excited about the quality, I wouldn't call it an easy year. The reality is that growing wine grapes in Napa Valley is a tremendous amount of work. The work that we do in our vineyards, within each block and on each vine, is in response to the vintage at hand. So understanding that this season got off to an early start, we were running 2 weeks early, meant we had a lot of work to do right away. And there's a penalty for being late with every task that we do in the vineyard. Take suckering, for example, which is the removal of unwanted shoots. We do that in the springtime, releasing the vine's vigor to encourage the growth of the remaining shoots. If you suckered your vineyard blocks too late this year, or maybe you held back and didn't do early season irrigation, you suckered those vines too late, the remaining shoots aren't going to be strong enough to each carry their 2 clusters of grapes. And when you come around to thin during thinning time, you're going to drop more on the ground than you would have had to if you'd sucker earlier. So just one example how we're really trying to match our viticultural practices to the vintage at hand. I'd like to add one other comment which I think is interesting. You know, I have a degree in ecology, I have a degree in viticulture, but sometimes I wish I had a degree in psychology. This time of year is a time of excitement and a little bit of anxiety. I was talking to a vineyard consultant recently and I said, gosh, it's a great year, isn't it? He said, yeah, I'm worried. I said, why are you worried? He said he's worried about the winemakers' picking decisions. He wants to be sure that they are ready to pick when the grapes are ready, that they're not hung up on a certain calendar date, like, oh, I'm never going to pick Cab in September. Can't be true, can't be right. He really wants to make sure that they're open-minded, that they're out there in the vineyard checking the grapes, and that they too are able to respond to the vintage at hand. Another way to describe the importance of the psychological aspects of harvest is an analogy to the restaurant business. You can think of a fine dining restaurant. You can think that every day they go through a cycle. In the morning, people arrive as early as 4 in the morning, start prepping vegetables, start baking bread. During the day, there's tremendous preparation and planning, and just before the dinner service, there's some anxiety, some excitement, and then they have the execution of the fine meals, delivering a fantastic experience to customers, and at the end of the day, they can sit there and be satisfied with what a great job they did. The next day, they start it all over again. Here, growing grapes in Napa Valley, we have a similar experience, but the reality is we only cook dinner once a year. So at this point, we've had 9 months of preparation, 9 months of work and planning, none of the satisfaction yet. We're just about to get to the execution of harvest. We're just about to deliver that fantastic experience for our customers, which are the wineries that purchase our grapes. So there's a lot of anxiety. Again, it's that moment just before we begin the dinner service. We're really excited. We're also a little anxious. So we are really gearing up to get going. Within our ranch at Trefethen, the first grapes that we pick each year are for one of our winery clients that produces sparkling wine. We expect to begin picking Pinot Noir for sparkling next week. That's actually not the earliest sparkling harvest we've had. Back in 2004, we started on July 28th. This is actually a warmer year than 2004, but 2004 was a light crop, so it ripened very quickly. We expect to begin picking our own grapes, Chardonnay and Pinot Noir, for still wines probably right around Labor Day. Again, I look forward to your questions, and at this point I'd like to introduce Allison. Before Allison begins to speak, we have a quick interlude from Executive Director
Just want to remind
Jennifer.
everyone that the hashtag is #NVGHarvest on Twitter, and we do have some questions which we'll get to after Allison speaks.
Thanks, John. My name is Allison Cellini. I'm the Assistant Viticulturist for Renteria Vineyard Management and a committee member for the Napa Valley Grapegrowers. I'm going to talk to you guys today a little bit about what we do, what we're seeing around the valley right now, and some of the technology that we've implemented this year. To touch a bit on the weather, John and I were actually talking about this a little bit before. From a vineyard management perspective, farming in nearly every microclimate in the valley gives us kind of a big picture of what this vintage is looking like as a whole. And so far we're seeing a lot of consistency in the ripening throughout the whole valley. Because of the great weather, harvest is looking like it's about 2 to 2.5 weeks early for us this year. We actually started harvesting Sauvignon Blanc up in Pope Valley last Friday, and we continue to harvest it today. And looking at the data, that's 10 days earlier than our previous record for early harvests up in Pope Valley, so it's pretty amazing. This year it looks like it can be attributed a little bit to the warm spring with very few frost events. The warm weather in the first couple weeks of April led to a sharp increase in the accumulation of the degree days for the first part of the year over previous years. This allowed the vines to have a good even bud break and utilize the abundant sunlight and warm weather to grow nice and evenly. The combination of the warm days and the lack of cold nights and damaging frost allowed the vines to have a rapid growth period that put us ahead of timing, so it's really exciting. Further evidence of this was the very even and condensed bloom period that we saw, which shows us that the vines were and still are moving at a very uniform pace. Uniformity in the growth cycle creates uniformity at harvest, setting up for a pretty ideal vintage as of right now. Overall, like you guys were saying, I'm seeing loose Cab Sauv clusters, a little bit looser than previous years. Like you said, with quality, this isn't a bad thing. The loose clusters aid in the ripening because there's good sunlight penetration into the clusters, and usually this translates to smaller berries. Smaller berries creates a larger skin to pulp ratio, which will lead to pretty good phenolics in the wines this year, hopefully. At Renteria, we manage about 1,500 acres in the Napa Valley and makes up 12 of the 15 Napa appellations. So having acreage spread out through the valley has led us to become a little bit more tech savvy in how we operate and communicate within the company. As of a lot of different vineyard management companies and vineyard managers in the valley, we've issued iPads to all of our foremen and our supervisors this year. All of these iPads are equipped with ranch maps and NDVIs, petiole results, and brick sampling results. This allows our supervisors and foremen to be well informed. It helps educate them of what's happening in the vineyard, all the test results, and all of our timing. And not just having that information available to the viticulturists and the winemakers out there. Educating everyone has also been really helpful in the whole production of everything. We've seen that maybe the most useful feature, at least to me, has been the cameras on the iPads. When foremen see anything of a concern in the vineyards, we're notified immediately and have the picture that's geotagged and referenced of exactly where they're seeing it. Our acreage is comprised of about 405 different blocks throughout the valley, so having that geotag to reference where they're standing and where they see a concern is very, very helpful. We don't always just get pictures about concerns and issues. This time of the year we start seeing some really interesting and fun pictures. Some of the pictures we found is FedEx trucks stuck in the middle of a vineyard, or probably the world's largest Grenache cluster that I've ever seen. So there's also a lot of fun coming along with it, and it's a good tool out there for all of us.
Yeah, I'd just like to echo some of the comments that Allison said. I think, spring is such an important season in terms of determining the outcome of the vintage, both in terms of the weather. I mentioned some of the importance of the work that we do there, like suckering, but specifically in terms of the weather. I think that if we go back to April, that's really what's driving this early season. It was quite a warm April compared to April of last year. Temperatures on our ranch, the daily high temperature was 7 degrees warmer. The daily high on our ranch right here was 78 degrees this year. Here in April, which is quite warm. So we got off to a warm start, and I think that going into May bloom period, having a very good weather during bloom allowed for a lot of the clusters to enter bloom at the same time. And each grape begins as a flower, and so if all those flowers are opening and beginning their process of development at the same time, that is why, as we walk through the vineyards now and look at veraison, the change of color, particularly in the Cabernet, it's incredibly even. It's like all the clusters are on the same page. We're doing this color thinning pass that is one of the typical passes we take in the vineyard. And usually you go in there and you can say, oh, that cluster must have bloomed 2 weeks later than the others. It's still quite green. We're going to drop it on the ground. The reality is, so many of the clusters are on the same page. I think it's fantastic. It makes the color thinning pass very, very quick. It makes the crop look very good. What's really interesting is one of the things that Remi said. The green clusters that we're seeing aren't because of a different bloom period, but we're actually seeing the evidence that some of these clusters that were perhaps too exposed during that heat spell in late June, on an individual cluster, we actually find that on the sunny side, the grapes got stalled. They're still small, they're hard, and they're green. And on the inside, on the shady side, the grapes have plumped up and changed color. So really unusual. But certainly not good for quality. So those are among the clusters that we're dropping on the ground in this last thinning pass. Do we have some questions at this point?
Weather is certainly a question on Twitter this morning. I think we've covered it, but it was clear that we had some heat and that it's been cool recently. And so weather's always the big question mark. This is farming. But someone asked, mentioning Remi's points about it being hot and a dry season, and asking about climate change and if growers are seeing any indicators of that.
Well, from my perspective, I think people have seen not necessarily clear warming trends, but just a little bit more erratic weather, especially in the spring and fall. So later rain events in the spring, earlier rain events in the fall, and just a little bit more erratic behavior rather than a clear trend, because ultimately 2009, 10, and 11 were all actually cool vintages. So I think we're seeing just a little bit more erratic and unpredictable weather, but thankfully we have the tools to handle it.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. I think climate change is a big and important topic. It's also very complex. I think on the one side, we have to be responsible stewards of the properties that we farm. We have to look at our own emissions and try to reduce our own contributions to the problem. As far as our own climate, again, it's complex. These years that Remi mentioned that have been cool years for us have actually been some of the warmest years across the continental United States. Within California, the pattern that actually drives the cool, foggy weather in San Francisco is the warm, hot weather in the Central Valley. As that heat rises, it brings in that marine influence, and that's exactly why we were actually cooler in those years, 9, 10, 11. So it's hard to say what each year will bring, but it's easy to understand that what we need to do is be watching the weather and responding to it, really farming in real time.
So changing gears, there's also some questions about labor and whether any of you are seeing labor shortages this year.
Again, an important topic. I think that we had some conversations among vineyard managers and growers, certainly last year and again this year, during the busiest times. And so I mentioned the spring already. There's a lot of work that has to be done in the spring, and this year there was a lot that had to be done at the same time. During that time, I did hear of some companies that had a hard time finding workers. Since that time, it seems to have calmed down. As we get into harvest, we'll see. think the reality here in Napa Valley is that a lot of our workers are long-term, full-time employees. That's certainly the story here at Trefethen, is that we cultivate a sustainable workforce through our educational programs. It's so key, as Allison said, that we really understand these farm workers as the true viticulturists. Each one of them, these men and women out there in the vineyards, need to understand the details of what we're doing so that we get the quality that we want. And like I said, we've been working in these vineyards for 9 months already this year. So there's something to do practically year-round in these vineyards. And if we can cultivate that and keep that, we're not going to be as subject to the sort of up and downs of labor needs, labor issues, as other crops or even other regions with the same crop.
And I think there's a question here that bridges both of those, which is how do you get your farm workers to farm so differently year to year depending on weather? Maybe speaking to how every year can be different with different practices in place in the vineyard.
Yeah, us personally, we put a lot of time into educating our farm workers, and before every season or before every individual pass in a vineyard, we go through the precision and the technique that we want, the different pruning styles, the different trellising styles, and we really spend a lot of time training them and watching how they complete these tasks. And everything's about the precision in the Napa Valley, and that's shown through in our farm workers and their abilities out there.
And then maybe lastly, some prognosis about this year's quality and quantity. There is a question here about, is there any room for more grapes? Wasn't last year a record year? And how are the wineries handling that?
Well, demand continues to rise for Napa Valley grapes and Napa Valley wine, which is a great thing. And despite the 2012 harvest being above average, most of the grapes of 2013 are spoken for at this point, if not all. And the quality looks good. As my colleagues have mentioned, we had a uniform bloom. We're having uniform veraison. We have small berries. We had a good set, so we have an average to maybe above average crop, and it's looking really good. So prognosis is optimal.
Yeah, a little more on that. Often we use the bulk wine market as an indicator for the health of the wine market and grape market in general. And we have seen a little bit more inventory build up on the bulk wine market, which suggests that the size of the 2012 harvest really helped us avoid an acute shortage. That said, there's been tremendous demand for grapes this year. I had calls for people looking for Merlot grapes. It's the first time in years I've had those phone calls. So demand is there. Demand is definitely there for Napa Valley Cabernet. As we are going through a lot of replanting here at Trefethen Vineyard, so is the rest of Napa Valley. We're seeing the echo of a massive replanting that happened the late 80s and 1990s. We're going to see a lot of acres come out of production over the next few years as they get replanted. That's actually going to decrease the number of productive acres in the short term, which shows that, again, we are in somewhere between shortage and balance, especially when it comes to Napa Valley Cabernet.
Well, I'm glad that you mentioned replanting, John, because we just got a question in referencing in late 2012 a shortage of grapevines was reported. It seems that had little effect for 2013. Is that true? Some nurseries were reporting shortages.
I'd be happy to speak
and
to
there was
that.
high
I
demand.
think it's a fantastic question. So there was high demand. Going through the second half of 2012, nurseries across the state were looking forward to 2013 being one of their biggest years ever. There's fantastic enthusiasm for wine grape planting, certainly the replanting in Napa, but well beyond, across California and across the world. There are nurseries in California that are shipping grapevines to China. So they had tremendous demand. Unfortunately, that excitement was dampened by the identification of a new viral disease called red blotch. In reality, this is a disease that's been around probably for decades, but we're just learning more and more about it, including what we think is the virus that causes it and the ability to test for it. So, informed growers began asking their nurseries, hey, I'm glad you got my vines on order, I'm glad they're in production, I'd like to send some out for testing. And when they find out they have red blotch, they have the opportunity to say, hey, you know what, maybe not. And that really dampened the spirits of the nurseries and turned what was going to be a very exciting year into a somewhat challenging year. Again, we have a number of replant projects going on our ranch, and I can speak to the fact that most of our material that we had ordered tested clean, and we were happy to accept it and get it planted, so it didn't really slow us down too much. But there was one example of some budwood we wanted to use for grafting that did come back infected, and we decided not to use it. We're basically going to let the rootstock grow another year. I imagine that the same thing is playing out across the valley, that mostly we got the material we needed, but in many cases we have to be able to say we're going to slow down a little bit just to make sure that we get the quality of grapevine that we need.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And these three speakers, as well as other members of the Board of Directors of the Napa Valley Grape Growers, are available throughout the harvest season. www.napagrowers.org. Please get in touch with us, and thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks.
Thank you.